The fog clung to the peaks of the Monadlyeth Mountains like a damp, discarded wool blanket. In the village of Lochstub, the air was thick with the scent of peat smoke and the briny promise of the sea loch, but for PC Hamish Macbeth, the morning smelled mostly of damp dog and missed opportunities. Hamish sat on a low stone wall near the edge of the village, his long, lanky frame draped in a uniform that always looked a size too small, or perhaps it was just that Hamish looked a size too large for the constraints of officialdom. Beside him, Lugs, the ears-and paws-only dog of uncertain pedigree, was intently sniffing a clump of heather with the professional focus Hamish usually reserved for avoiding the sergeant at Strathbane. "It's a fine day for doing nothing, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his voice a soft Highland drawl, "and if we're very lucky, the world will forget we exist until the pubs open." His peace, however, was not destined to last. The silence of the glen was shattered by the aggressive, high-pitched whine of a high-performance engine. A sleek, silver sports car totally unsuited for the rutted, sheep-strewn tracks of Sutherlanter around the bend, spraying gravel over Hamish boots. It screeched to a halt, and out stepped a man who looked like he had been curated by a London department store specifically to annoy Highlanders. He was dressed in crisp, designer tweeds that had never seen a bramble, wearing leather brogues that shone with a light that didn't exist in nature. This was Julian Fawkes, a man who had recently bought the old Blackwood estate and proceeded to tell everyone in the local pub how to properly pour a pint of Guinness. "You there! Constable!" Fawkes shouted, waving a manicured hand. "I've been ringing the station for 20 minutes. Do you people ever actually work, or is the entire Scottish police force just a front for professional loitering?" Hamish slowly stood up, his face a mask of polite, vacant blinking. "It's a delicate balance, sir. If we work too hard, we disturb the sheep, and then there's no end of paperwork. Is there something I can do for you, or are you just admiring the mist? The mist is a nuisance, and so are you," Fawkes snapped. "There's someone sprawled out by the Blackwood Bridge. I nearly ran over them. They aren't moving, and they're blocking the best vantage point for my landscape architect." Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound that suggested the weight of the British Empire had just been placed on his shoulders. He whistled for Lugs. "A body, you say? Well now, that is a shame. I was just thinking the bridge looked particularly peaceful this morning." As they trekked toward the bridge, Fawkes marched ahead, complaining loudly about the lack of 5G reception and the backwardness of the locals. Hamish followed at a deceptively slow pace, his hazel eyes scanning the heather, the tree line, and the way the silver car had left deep, angry gouges in the soft verge. When they reached the bridge, the scene was indeed far from peaceful. Slumped against the ancient stone parapet was a figure in a bright yellow mackintosh. It was Arthur Pringle, a man known throughout Lochstub for two things: his obsessive birdwatching and his even more obsessive habit of reporting his neighbours for minor building code violations. Pringle's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and a single elegant knitting needle was protruding from the base of his skull. It looked almost artistic, if one cared for that sort of thing. "Oh dear," Hamish said softly, tilting his cap back. "It seems, mister, Pringle has finally found something worth reporting. Only, I don't think hell be the one filing the paperwork this time." Fawkes looked green. Is he dead?" "Extremely," Hamish replied, his gaze shifting from the body to a small, ruffled patch of moss nearby. And from the look of that needle, someone didn't appreciate his views on their handiwork. Hamish pulled out his notebook, but instead of writing, he stared at the mountains. The day had just become very complicated, and worse, he'd likely have to talk to DCI Blair before sunset. The silence that followed Julian Fawkes' gagging sounds was eventually broken by the distant, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter's unmistakable sound of Strathbane's finest, deciding that a murder in the Highlands required the maximum amount of expensive drama. Hamish Macbeth sighed, adjusting his cap and looking down at poor Arthur Pringle. The birdwatcher's binoculars were still looped around his neck, the lenses fogged by the morning mist, staring sightlessly at a horizon he would never see again. Lugs gave a low, mournful whine and sat back on his haunches, his mismatched ears twitching as the roar of engines drew closer. Within 20 minutes, the piece of Blackwood Bridge was utterly demolished. 2 police cruisers screamed up the track, followed by a black sedan that lurched to a halt with a violence that suggested the driver was personally offended by the scenery. Out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, his face already a shade of crimson that rivaled a sunset over the Minch. His belly strained against his waistcoat, and his small, piggish eyes were fixed on Hamish with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the crags and lightly scaring every grouse within 5 miles. "I might have known. I can't have a decent breakfast in Strathbane without some Highland turnip herder finding a corpse to ruin my day." What have you done to the scene? Trampled all over the evidence with those great clod-hopping boots of yours, I suppose. Hamish blinked, his expression shifting into the look of bovine vacancy that usually drove Blair to the brink of a stroke. I've done nothing but stand here and admire the needlework, sir, Hamish said mildly, gesturing with a long, lazy finger toward the back of Pringle's neck. Mister, Faffer Welks here found him. I was just keeping the sheep from nibbling on his mackintosh. Blair shoved past Hamish, nearly knocking him into the heather, and peered at the body. A knitting needle. For God's sake, Macbeth, it's a village of old biddies and wool shop enthusiasts. This isn't a mystery, it's a domestic dispute that got out of hand. Some grandmother lost her temper because he didn't like her scones. He turned his glare toward Julian F. Fawkes, who was still looking decidedly pale. And who are you? Another one of these pampered incomers making life difficult for the tax-paying public. I am Julian Fawkes of Blackwood House, the man said, trying to regain some of his metropolitan dignity despite the mud on his brogues. I expect a full and professional investigation. Pringle was a nuisance. Certainly had been filing complaints against my proposed helipad for weeks, but murder on my doorstep is simply bad form. Blair's eyes lit up. Complaints, you say? Obstructing progress, was he? Interfering with a man's right to enjoy his property? Blair turned back to the body, a nasty smile spreading across his face. Typical. A local busybody sticking his nose where it doesn't belong and getting it snapped off. It's obvious, isn't it? One of these surly locals finally snapped. Probably that blacksmith with the temper, or the postmistress who doesn't like his tone. Mr. Pringle was a very thorough man, sir, Hamish offered softly, looking at the way the knitting needle was angled. It had been driven in with a single, precise thrust, not the work of a frantic, angry amateur, but someone who knew exactly where the spine met the skull. He kept records of everything. If he saw something he shouldn't have, he'd have written it down. Don't you start with your theories, Macbeth, Blair snapped, stabbing a finger into Hamish's chest. You're a village copper. Your job is to direct traffic and keep the tourists from falling off the cliffs. My team will handle forensics and heavy lifting. You stay out of the way. In fact, why don't you go and make yourself useful by fetching us some tea? And not that grey water you call tea-proper stuff. Hamish nodded slowly, his eyes catching a small detail that Blair had completely overlooked in his rush to bully the witness. A few feet from Pringle's outstretched hand, caught in a gorse bush, was a small tuft of bright teal-coloured mohair wool. It fluttered in the breeze, a tiny splash of unnatural colour against the muted greens and browns of the moor. Hamish didn't point it out. Experience had taught him that giving Blair a clue was like giving a loaded gun to a toddler. Someone was bound to get hurt, and it wouldn't be the criminal. "Tea it is, sir," Hamish said, whistling for lugs. "The hotel has a very nice blend. I'll just wander back and see what Mrs. Gillespie has in the pot. I'm sure the village will be quite full of talk by the time I get there." As Blair began shouting orders to his shivering subordinates, Hamish turned his back on the chaos of the bridge. He walked slowly, his hands deep in his pockets, his mind already filtering through the residents of Lockdub. Arthur Pringle had been a man with many enemies, but most of them were the sort who grumbled over a pint, not the sort who carried knitting needles onto a lonely bridge in the morning fog. He needed to know who was working with teal mohair, and more importantly, who Pringle had been watching through those binoculars just before the world went dark. The roar of DCI Blair's voice faded into the misty distance, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of Hamish's boots on the damp gravel path leading back toward the heart of Lockstub. Lugs trotted ahead, his tail a low-slung banner of contentment now that the shouting had ceased. Hamish felt the small tuft of teal mohair resting in his pocket, a tiny, fibrous secret that felt heavier than its weight suggested. In his mind's eye, he could see the village as if it were a chessboard, and Arthur Pringle had been the piece that delighted in checking everyone else's moves. Pringle hadn't just watched birds, he watched the laundry lines, the milk deliveries, and the late-night lights in windows that should have been dark. By the time Hamish reached the Tommel Castle Hotel, the village grapevine was already humming with a low-voltage electricity. Mrs. Gillespie, the proprietor, was standing behind the heavy oak reception desk, her face set in an expression of grim satisfaction that usually accompanied a particularly juicy piece of tragedy. The smell of frying bacon and old floor wax hung in the air, a comforting contrast to the cold, metallic scent of the crime scene. "A terrible business, Hamish," she said, though her eyes sparkled with the kinetic energy of a woman who knew she was about to be the centre of a logistical whirlwind. "Arthur Pringle, of all people. They say he was pinned to the bridge like a butterfly in a collection box. Is it true? And with a knitting needle? The postmistress says it was a skewer from the curry shop, but I told her Arthur was far too thin-blooded for spicy food." Hamish leaned against the desk, his frame folding into a posture of practiced exhaustion. It was a needle, Right enough, Mrs. Gillespie. A professional-looking bit of work for such an unprofessional end. DCI Blair is up there now, turning the heather upside down and looking for someone to shout at. He sent me for tea, though I suspect he'd prefer a gallon of bile if it were on the menu. Hell, get what I give him, she huffed, already reaching for a heavy silver tray. But tell me, who would want to do it for Arthur? The man was a nuisance, certainly. He reported me for the height of the hotel chimney last winter, and he had poor Mr. Patel at the shop nearly in tears over the placement of his vegetable crates. But murder? It seems a bit much for a planning dispute. People have been killed for less in the Highlands, Hamish remarked, his eyes wandering to a basket of knitting that sat on a chair in the corner of the lounge. He noted the colour-soft greys, a muddy brown, and a vibrant, screaming purple. No teal. Arthur saw things, Mrs. Gillespie. That was his hobby. And sometimes, when you look through binoculars long enough, you see something that looks back. He accepted a steaming mug of coffee-real coffee, dark and bitter, and took a long, thoughtful sip. As he drank, the hotel door swung open, admitting a gust of cold air and Priscilla Halberton-Smythe. She looked, as she always did, like she had stepped out of a high-fashion catalogue that had been specifically designed for gentry at leisure. Her blonde hair was perfectly untouched by the Highland wind, and her blue eyes held a glimmer of concerned intelligence that Hamish found both attractive and deeply inconvenient for his peace of mind. "Hamish," she said, walking toward him with a brisk, purposeful stride. "I heard the news at the estate. My father is furious because the police have blocked the bridge. He has a guest arriving from London who doesn't know the back tracks." She paused, her gaze dropping to Lugs, who was hopefully sniffing her leather boots. "Is it true? About Arthur Pringle?" "It is," Hamish replied, offering her a tired smile. "He's met a very sharp end, Priscilla. Blair is convinced it's a local, someone who finally snapped under the weight of Arthur's petty grievances. He's currently looking for a villain with a grudge and a pair of sturdy boots." Priscilla lowered her voice, leaning closer. "Then Blair is a fool, which we already knew. Arthur was at the estate 2 days ago. Hamish. He wasn't there to complain about the chimneys. He wanted to see the guest list for the upcoming grouse shoot. He seemed agitated. He told me he'd seen a ghost near the old Blackwood ruins. A ghost in a silver car." Hamish's mind flashed back to Julian Fawkes and his sleek, expensive vehicle. Fawkes had claimed to be new to the area, yet Pringle had reacted as if he'd seen a spectre from the past. The connection was there, simmering beneath the surface like the peat fires that burned for decades. A ghost in a car, Hamish mused, his fingers brushing the mohair in his pocket. That's a very modern sort of haunting. And did he say anything else? About what this ghost was doing? "Only that it was picking flowers where no flowers grow," Priscilla said, her brow furrowing. "I thought he'd finally gone around the bend, but now I wonder if he found a weed he wasn't supposed to pull." Hamish nodded, the lazy blink returning to his eyes. He needed to get back to the bridge with the tea before Blair's blood pressure reached atmospheric levels, but the mooching had already provided a far better yield than any forensic sweep. He had a ghost, a silver car, and a tuft of teal wool that didn't belong to the hotel's knitting circle. He also knew that Arthur Pringle hadn't been killed for what he reported, but for what he was planning to report next. "Thank you, Priscilla," Hamish said, picking up the heavy tea tray. "You've given me a lot to chew on." Almost as much as Mrs. Gillespie's scones. As he stepped back out into the thickening fog, Hamish knew the easy part of the day was over. He had to play the fool for Blair while keeping the ghost in his sights, all while making sure he didn't solve the case so quickly that the superintendent decided he was wasted in Lochdub. The trick was to be just smart enough to catch a killer and just lazy enough to keep his job. The heavy silver tray rattled as Hamish made his way back toward Blackwood Bridge, the steam from the tea and coffee curling into the thickening Highland mist. Lugs trotted faithfully at his heels, occasionally pausing to investigate a particularly interesting scent in the gorse, oblivious to the storm brewing ahead. As the bridge came back into view, Hamish could see that the scene had transitioned from a quiet tragedy into a chaotic circus. DCI Blair was pacing the narrow road, his face an alarming shade of magenta, while 2 of his detectives from Strathbane were clumsily poking through the undergrowth, with long sticks, as if they were looking for a lost golf ball rather than a murderer's trail. "About time, Macbeth," Blair roared, snatching a mug of tea from the tray before Hamish could even set it down. He took a gulp, winced at the heat, and glared at the cooling body of Arthur Pringle. "While you've been dawdling and gossiping with the locals, we've made actual progress. Real police work, not that mystical nonsense you call intuition. We've found our prime suspect." Hamish blinked slowly, his eyes shifting to the person standing between 2 uniformed officers near the police cruiser. It was Angus MacLeod, the village blacksmith, a man whose hands were permanently stained with coal dust and whose temper was as legendary as his skill with a hammer. Angus looked terrified, his massive shoulders hunched, and his cap clutched tightly in his blackened fingers. "Angus?" Hamish asked mildly, setting the tray on the flat stone of the bridge's parapet. "And what would a man like Angus want with a knitting needle, sir? He's more of a sledgehammer sort of fellow, I would have thought." "Don't be thick, Macbeth," Blair snapped, spraying a bit of tea as he spoke. Pringle reported MacLeod 3 times last month for illegal smoke emissions from the forge. Threatened to have his business closed. MacLeod was heard in the pub saying he'd like to see Pringle silenced. "And look at him! He's sweating like a pig in a slaughterhouse." It's an open and shut case, a crime of passion by a disgruntled peasant. Hamish looked at Angus, whose eyes were pleading. "Is that right, Angus? Did you bring a knitting needle up here to settle the score?" "I never," Angus croaked, his voice cracking. "I was out looking for a stray ewe, Hamish. I saw the cars and came to see if I could help. I haven't touched a knitting needle since I was 6, and my grandmother tried to teach me the pearl stitch. I wouldn't even know which end to hold." "Save it for the station," Blair barked, gesturing for his men to lead Angus away. "He's the only one with a motive, the only one with the physical strength to drive that needle home, and he was found lurking near the scene. Macbeth, you stay here and guard the perimeter until the meat wagon arrives. And try not to lose the body while I am gone." As the police cars sped away, tyres churning up the mud and leaving Angus MacLeod to a fate he clearly didn't deserve. The silence returned to Blackwood Bridge, heavier than before. Hamish stood still, listening to the wind whistle through the ancient stones. He didn't believe for a second that Angus was the killer. The blacksmith's hands were too calloused, his movements too blunt for the surgical precision required to kill a man with a single needle. Hamish knelt by the spot where the body had been, ignoring the yellow police tape that fluttered in the breeze. He looked again at the gorse bush where he had found the teal mohair. Now that Blair was gone, he could look closer without being accused of interfering. Beneath the bush, half buried in the dank peat, was a small rectangular object. He reached down and pulled it out. It was a high-end digital camera lens cap, embossed with the logo of a very expensive German brand. Now, why would a birdwatcher like Pringle lose his lens cap over here? Hamish muttered to Lugs, when his camera is still in his bag, neatly capped and stowed. He looked toward the old Blackwood ruins, the crumbling stone skeleton of a manor house that sat on a ridge overlooking the bridge. Priscilla had mentioned Pringle saw a ghost in a silver car. If Pringle had been watching the ruins through his binoculars, he might have seen something that required a closer look, perhaps even a photograph. And if he had dropped his lens cap in a hurry, it meant he had been surprised. Hamish stood up, his gaze fixing on the ruins. The teal wool in his pocket felt like it was humming. He remembered seeing a woman in the village earlier, that weaker, sophisticated, sharp-featured woman who had been staying at the hotel. She had been wearing a long, elegant scarf that shimmered in the light. "Teal," Hamish whispered. He didn't move toward the ruins yet. Instead, he walked back to the tray of tea, poured himself a fresh cup, and sat on the bridge. He needed to think. Blair was busy arresting the wrong man, which gave Hamish a narrow window of opportunity. He had to find out who owned that silver car and what they were picking in the ruins. But more importantly, he had to figure out how to prove it without making himself look like a hero. If he solved this too cleanly, he'd be promoted to Strathbane within the month, and he had no intention of leaving his cosy stove and his quiet Highland life for a desk and a view of a parking lot. "Let's go, Lugs," Hamish said, tipping the rest of his tea into the heather. "We have some mooching to do, and I think the postmistress might have noticed who's been buying teal yarn lately." The mist was beginning to lift, revealing the jagged, unforgiving beauty of the peaks, but the atmosphere in Lockdub remained as thick as Mrs. McLean's mutton stew. Hamish Macbeth strolled toward the village post office, his pace so leisurely that a casual observer might have thought he was a man without a care in the world, rather than a police officer with a murder on his hands and a blacksmith in a prison cell. Lugs trotted beside him, occasionally stopping to mark a telegraph pole with an air of territorial authority. The post office was the nervous system of the village, a place where secrets were sorted as efficiently as the mail, and Mrs. Wellington, the postmistress, was the undisputed keeper of the ledger. As the bell chimed upon his entry, the sharp, sweet scent of penny sweets and old paper greeted him. Mrs. Wellington was behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the tip of her nose as she scrutinized a stack of pension books. She looked up, her eyes narrowing with the predatory instinct of a woman who had already heard 3 versions of the morning's tragedy and was waiting for the official 4th. "I suppose you've come to tell me the village is crawling with murderers, Hamish Macbeth," she began, not waiting for him to speak. And that poor Angus MacLeod has been dragged off to Strathbane like a common criminal. The man couldn't kill a fly without apologizing to it first, and well, you know it. Hamish leaned against the counter, looking down at the glass display of humbugs and licorice all sorts. DCI Blair has his ways, Mrs. Wellington. He likes a quick result, even if it's the wrong one. It keeps the paperwork tidy. But I was wondering, did Arthur Pringle receive many parcels lately? He was a man of specific tastes, was he not, Mrs. Wellington sniffed. Parcels? Mostly bird-watching journals and those odd little packets of specialized seed. But he was here yesterday, agitated as a hen in a fox hunt. He was posting a letter-registered mail, no less to a law firm in London. He wouldn't let me see the address properly, but he kept muttering about justice being served and the past catching up. I told him he was being melodramatic, but Arthur always did enjoy a bit of theatre. Hamish mind whirred beneath his calm exterior. A letter to a London law firm combined with a ghost in a silver car suggested something far more complex than a local grudge. And the newcomers, Mrs. Wellington. Those staying at the Blackwood estate or the hotel, are any of them particularly fond of knitting? She let out a dry, rattling laugh. In this weather, Hamish, everyone knits. But if you're looking for something fancy, there's Mrs. Graham. One that arrived with a silver sports car. She's been here twice to buy stamps for postcards to Switzerland. She's always draped in those expensive wool's mohair and silk. I shouldn't wonder. I saw her yesterday in the general store, complaining that the teal yarn they stocked wasn't the right hue for her project. The word teal clicked into place like the bolt of a rifle. Hamish thanked her, ignored her pointed questions about the autopsy, and stepped back out into the chilly air. He didn't go back to the station. Instead, he made his way toward the Tommel Castle Hotel, where he knew the ghost in the silver car, Mrs. Graham was likely enjoying a late breakfast. The hotel lounge was quiet, the fire in the hearth crackling softly. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe was gone, likely back to the estate to manage her father's temper, but seated in a wing-back chair by the window was a woman who looked entirely out of place in the rugged Highlands. She was sharp-featured, with eyes the colour of flint and hair pulled back in a style that suggested an uncompromising nature. On the table beside her sat a basket of yarn, and draped over the arm of the chair was a half-finished scarf in a vibrant, shimmering teal. Hamish removed his cap, his expression one of humble, stumbling confusion. "Forgive the intrusion, Mom. I am P.C. Macbeth. I believe you're staying here at the hotel." The woman looked him up and down, her lip curling slightly at his dishevelled uniform. "I am Heather Graham. Is there a problem, officer? I was under the impression this village was meant to be peaceful, yet I've heard nothing but sirens all morning." "It's a terrible business," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper. "A man was found at the bridge, Arthur Pringle. I believe he might have been a neighbour of yours at the estate." Mrs. Graham's needles stopped clicking for a fraction of a second, hesitation so brief most would have missed it. "I didn't know the man. I only arrived a week ago to oversee some family business regarding the Blackwood ruins. My late husband's family had interests here." "Interests," Hamish repeated, his gaze drifting to the camera lens cap he still had in his pocket. "It's a funny thing, but Mr. Pringle was very interested in those ruins too. He seemed to think there was something hidden there. Not gold or silver, you understand, but something more permanent, like a memory." Mrs. Graham stood up, her knitting clutched tightly in her hand. "I find your Highland superstitions exhausting, Constable. If you have no official business, I'd like to finish my tea in peace." Hamish bowed his head slightly, the image of the bumbling village copper perfected. "Of course, Ma'am. My apologies. I'll leave you to your wool." As he walked away, he felt her eyes on his back. He knew now that the teal mohair hadn't come from a local's hobby, but from a woman with a family interest and a very modern car. The mystery wasn't about birdwatching or planning commissions. It was about what lay beneath the stones of Blackwood, and what Arthur Pringle had seen through his lens that made a sophisticated woman reach for a knitting needle. The chill in the hotel lounge seemed to follow Hamish out into the street, a cold finger tracing the line of his spine. He did not return to the police station to check on the progress of DCI Blair's interrogation of poor Angus MacLeod. He knew exactly how that would be going. Blair would be shouting about forensic certainties, while Angus sat in bewildered silence, wondering how a man who spent his life over a fire could be accused of such a cold, clinical killing. Instead, Hamish whistled low for lugs and began the long, steep climb toward the Blackwood ruins. The path was narrow and slick with the morning's moisture, winding through ancient pines that seemed to huddle together against the encroaching grey sky. As he climbed, Hamish's mind returned to the phrase Priscilla had shared, "picking flowers where no flowers grow." In the harsh, acidic soil of the Highlands, very little bloomed this late in the year. least of all among the tumbled stones of a manor house that had burned to the ground in a cloud of scandal 40 years ago. The Blackwood family had been wealthy Sassenachs who had tried to transform the glen into a private playground, only to vanish after a fire claimed the life of the youngest daughter. The ruins were now a skeletal reminder of failed ambition, avoided by locals who claimed the wind through the stones sounded too much like a child's laugh. When he reached the ridge, the wind whipped at his sultan pepper hair. The ruins sat in a hollow, a jagged circle of blackened granite and collapsed timber. Luggs immediately became agitated, his hackles rising as he circled a particular patch of ground near the old cellar entrance. Hamish knelt, his knees protesting the damp earth, and looked at what lay beneath a heavy, flat stone that had clearly been recently disturbed. There were no flowers here, but there were signs of digging small, precise excavations that looked more like archaeological work than a search for buried treasure. Beside a pile of fresh dirt sat a discarded trowel, and near it, a small, transparent envelope of the kind used by forensic teams, or, more likely, high-end private investigators. Inside the envelope was a fragment of something white and porous. Hamish didn't need a lab to tell him what it was. The texture was unmistakable to a man who had seen his share of sheep carcasses on the hills. It was a fragment of bone, but it was too small for a sheep, and the shape suggested a human digit. "So that's your interest, Mrs. Graham," Hamish whispered, the wind snatching his words. "The past isn't just catching up, it's being dug up." He stood and scanned the horizon. From this vantage point, the Blackwood Bridge was perfectly visible. Arthur Pringle, with his high-powered binoculars and his penchant for prying, would have had a front-row seat to any activity up here. He would have seen a sophisticated woman in a silver car, perhaps accompanied by a hired hand, digging in the ruins of her family's shame. If Pringle had realized she was looking for the remains of the dead daughter, one everyone assumed had perished in Cotter, but whose body was never found, would have had a story far more valuable than a dispute over a helipad. A sudden movement in the tree line caught Hamish's eye. A flash of silver sun hitting the body of a car, parked half-hidden down an old logging trail. Mrs. Graham hadn't returned to the hotel. For a nap she had come back to finish her work. Hamish felt a prickle of danger. A woman who would drive a knitting needle into a man's brain to protect a 40-year-old secret was not someone who would be intimidated by a lone village constable with a penchant for poaching. He reached into his pocket and felt the teal mohair. It was the red herring that wasn't a herring at Allet, was a piece of the killer's vanity, a fragment of the very luxury that set the Sassenachs apart from the people of the glen. He realized then that Blair's arrest of Angus Mac Leod was exactly what the killer wanted. While the incompetent local police focused on a blacksmith's grudge, the real evidence was being bagged, tagged, and driven away in a silver sports car. "We need to be careful, Luggs," Hamish said, his voice barely a murmur. "If we move too fast, shell bolt. If we move too slow, Angus goes to jail, and the truth stays buried in these stones." He began to descend the ridge, not toward the village, but toward the logging trail. He needed to see who else was with Mrs. Graham. A woman of her stature didn't dig in the dirt alone. There was someone Elsa-Mione invisible who had been helping her. And if Hamish was right about the social dynamics Priscilla had hinted at, the killer wasn't just hiding a body, they were hiding a bloodline. The descent from the ridge was a silent affair, with Hamish moving through the bracken with the predatory grace of a man who had spent many a moonlit night avoiding the eyes of gamekeepers. Luggs followed suit, his belly low to the ground, sensing the shift in his master's temperament from lazy wandering to the focused intensity of the hunt. The silver flash Hamish had seen earlier was now more defined, sleek, arrogant tail of Heather Graham's sports car poking out from behind a stand of ancient, twisted rowans. But it wasn't the car that held Hamish's attention. It was the second figure standing near the open trunk, a man whose presence in the village had been so quiet as to be almost spectral. It was Julian, Falkes landscape architect, a man named Miller who had been seen drifting around the Blackwood estate with a clipboard and a surveyor's level for the past week. Up close, however, Miller didn't look like a man interested in placing azaleas. He wore tactical trousers and a heavy wax jacket, and his hands, currently gloved in latex, were carefully sealing a small wooden box. Mrs. Graham stood beside him, the teal mohair scarf wrapped tightly around her throat like a stylish noose, her face a mask of cold, aristocratic determination. "Is that the last of it?" she asked, her voice carrying sharply in the thin mountain air. "The primary remains are secure," Miller replied, his accent a clipped, professional London tone. Pringle was a fool to keep those photographs. If he hadn't tried to play the amateur detective, he might have lived long enough to see his birds fly south. He was getting too close to the cellar floor, Heather. He recognized the pattern of the foundation. Stonesh knew they'd been moved recently. Hamish crouched behind a moss-covered boulder, his mind racing. The ghost in the silver car wasn't a spirit, it was the return of the Blackwood legacy. Heather Graham wasn't just a visitor, she was the daughter who was supposed to have died in that fire 40 years ago. But she hadn't died. The bones they were currently creating belonged to someone else, perhaps the real Heather. While this woman had lived a life of stolen luxury in London and Switzerland, only returning now to scrub the final traces of a decades-old crime before Julian F. Foucault's construction crews accidentally unearthed the truth. The motive was not as great as international espionage. It was the most Highland of since the preservation of social standing at the cost of a soul. Arthur Pringle, with his prying eyes and his binoculars, had seen the architect digging where no gardens were planned. He had likely recognized the woman from old village photographs, or perhaps had simply seen too much of the bone fragment through his lens. He had been killed not because he was a nuisance, but because he was a witness to a resurrection that was never meant to happen. "We leave for Strathbane in 20 minutes, Mrs. Graham said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Once these are in the incinerator at the private clinic, the Blackwood name is finally clean. That oaf of a policeman in the village is too busy arresting the local blacksmith to care about a few old stones." Hamish felt a surge of cold anger. It was one thing to let Blair play the fool, but it was another entirely to let an innocent man like Angus Mac Loud take the fall for a cold-blooded execution. He looked at Luggs, then at the heavy, silver-plated thermos sitting on the bumper of the car. He knew he couldn't take them both down by force or not, with Miller looking like he carried more than just surveying equipment in his jacket. He needed to use the one thing they expected of him: his stupidity. He stood up, not with a weapon drawn, but with his cap in his hand and the most vacant, wide-eyed expression he could muster. He stumbled out from behind the boulder, tripping slightly on a root for added effect. "Ow! Begging your pardon, Mum," Hamish called out, his Highland lilt doubling in thickness. "I didn't mean to startle you. I was just out looking for a lost sheep, a big woolly thing with a mind of its own. It's a terrible place for a car. This. Very hard on the suspension, I'd imagine." Miller's hand went instinctively to his waistband, but Mrs. Graham laid a restraining hand on his arm, her eyes narrowing as she recognized the useless constable from the hotel. "Constable Macbeth," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Still wandering the hills? I should think Yow'd be at the station helping your superior with his prisoner." Well, DCI Blair has everything under control," Hamish said, stepping closer with a clumsy, heavy-footed gait. "He's a very thorough man, the inspector. He's got poor Angus convinced he's a murderer, though the man can barely kill a pint of ale. I just thought I'd take the air. It's a fine afternoon for a drive, though you're a long way from the main road." As he spoke, Hamish's eyes darted to the open chest. He could see the corner of the wooden box and, more importantly, a small, leather-bound notebook peeking out from Miller's side pocket Pringle's missing journal. The trap was half-formed in his mind. He needed them to think he was no threat, a mere bumpkin to be managed, while he prepared the ground for a revelation that even Blair couldn't ignore. "A sheep, you say?" Miller asked, his eyes hard and suspicious. "A big one," Hamish lied, flashing a toothy, dim-witted grin. "Almost as big as the secret you're packing into that boot. ID wager." The air went still. The lazy policeman had just dropped the mask a fraction too far, and the silence that followed was as sharp as a knitting needle. The tension in the clearing was brittle, a physical weight that seemed to push the mist back into the trees. Miller's hand remained frozen near his jacket, his body coiled with the practiced stillness of a man who dealt in violence as casually as others dealt in gossip. Heather Graham, however, merely let out a sharp, cold laugh that sounded like ice cracking on a winter loch. She adjusted the teal mohair scarf at her throat, her flinty eyes never leaving Hamish's face. "A secret, Constable?" she asked, her voice silky and dangerous. "I think you've spent too much time in the Highland fog. This is a private estate, and we are merely collecting family heirlooms before the renovations begin. Surely even a village policeman understands the concept of private property." Hamish scratched his head, looking down at his boots with an air of profound apology. "Oh, I understand it fine, Mum. It's just that Mr. Pringle, the man who was killed this morning, God rest his prying soul, had a very peculiar idea about property. He thought that if a secret was buried deep enough, it eventually became the property of the earth. And he was great for the land, was Arthur, always digging or watching others dig." Hamish took a slow, shuffling step toward the silver car, his eyes wandering toward the wooden box in the trunk. He told the postmistress he'd seen a ghost in a silver car. "Now, I am a simple man, but I've lived here long enough to know that ghosts don't usually drive high-performance vehicles or wear mohair. They tend to stay in the ruins, unless, of course, they never died at all." Miller took a step forward, his shadow falling long across the damp grass. "I think you should leave, Macbeth." You're trespassing, and you're bothering a lady who has already had a very stressful morning." "I am sure she has," Hamish agreed, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "It must be hard work, digging up the past while the real police are busy arresting the wrong man. DCI Blair is a fine officer, mind you, but he wouldn't know a clue if it bit him on his very large nose. He's convinced Angus the blacksmith did it, because Angus is big and surly. But I keep thinking about that knitting needle. It was a delicate bit of work. Surgical, you might say. Not the sort of thing a man with coal dust under his nails would use." He looked directly at Heather Graham then, the mask of the bumbling local slipping just enough to show the sharp, skeptical mind beneath. It's the sort of thing a woman might carry in her knitting bag. A woman who was so worried about Arthur's photographs that she decided to stop him before he could post that registered letter to the London lawyers. The ones who handle the Blackwood estate. The silence returned, but this time it was heavy with the scent of a trap. Hamish knew he was playing a dangerous game. He had no backup, his radio was back in the station, and Miller was clearly more than an architect. But Hamish also knew the Sassenach pride. They underestimated the stupid Highlander because they couldn't imagine anyone being smarter than their own reflection. "You have no proof of anything, you pathetic little man," Heather said, her composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. "You're a failure in a cheap uniform. You couldn't even keep your own village safe from a nuisance like Pringle." "You're right about the proof, Ma'am," Hamish said, sighing as he leaned against a rowan tree. "It's a terrible weakness of mine. But you see, I've already told the postmistress that if I didn't come back from my walk, she was to give that registered letter Arthur posted one. He didn't actually send because I intercepted Ito, the superintendent in Strathbane. It's amazing what people tell you when you just sit and drink tea with them. This was a blatant lie. Of letter was halfway to London, by no but the effect was instantaneous." Heather's face went the colour of the Monadlyeth mist, and Miller's eyes darted toward the car keys. They couldn't risk the letter. They couldn't risk the possibility that the lazy policeman had been one step ahead of them all along. "Get the box!" Heather hissed at Miller. "We're leaving, now." "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Hamish said, his hand dropping to the heavy wooden truncheon at his belt. "Lugs here hasn't had his dinner, and he's very protective of his territory. And as for the car, well, the road back to the village is very narrow, and I am afraid I left a hazard in the middle of the track. A very large, very heavy hazard." As Miller reached for the car door, the sound of a distant, frantic whistle echoed through the glen. It wasn't the police, it was the signal Hamish had arranged with the local poachist ones who truly ran the hills when the sun went down. The trap was closing, but the killer wasn't going to go quietly. Miller's hand went to his jacket, and this time he wasn't looking for a notebook. The stillness of the glen was shattered as Miller's hand emerged from his jacket, not with a surveyor's tool, but with a compact, matte black pistol. The sophisticated veneer of the landscape architect vanished, replaced by the efficient coldness of a professional cleaner. Heather Graham didn't scream. She simply stepped back, her face a mask of jagged fury, her fingers clutching the teal mohair scarf as if it were a talisman of her stolen status. "Kill him, Miller," she commanded, her voice thin and sharp. "We can bury him with the rest of the family trash. No one in this godforsaken village will miss a lazy failure like Macbeth." Hamish didn't wait for the trigger to pull. He had spent his life navigating the treacherous bogs and shifting scree of the Highlands, and he knew that in a world of high-tech violence, the earth itself was the greatest equalizer. With a sharp, guttural command, he sent lugs low toward Miller's ankles. The dog, usually a picture of shaggy indolence, transformed into a blur of teeth and tawny fur. As Miller instinctively shifted his aim downward to deal with the canine projectile, Hamish moved with a deceptive speed that would have stunned DCI Blair. He didn't run away, he lunged toward the rowan tree, grabbing the heavy silver tea tray he had borrowed from the hotel and discarded earlier in the undergrowth. The first shot rang out, a flat, dry crack that echoed off the crags, but the bullet spent itself harmlessly in the trunk of a pine. Hamish swung the heavy tray like a buckler, catching Miller's second shot with a jarring metallic clang that sent a shockwave up his arm. The force of the impact told him he couldn't play shield maiden for long. "Lugs, away!" he whistled. The dog veered off into the heather, drawing Miller's focus into the shifting shadows of the scrub. Hamish ducked behind a ridge of peat, the smell of damp earth filling his nostrils. He knew every inch of this logging trail. He knew that 20 yards behind the silver car, the ground didn't just slope. It collapsed into a black poter-deep, hidden sinkhole masked by a treacherous carpet of bright green moss. To a Sassenach, it looked like a lush meadow. To a Highlander, it was a watery grave. "You're making this very difficult, Macbeth," Miller shouted, his boots crunching on the gravel as he circled the car. "Just stay still, and it'll be quick." You've got no backup and nowhere to go. I've got the whole of Sutherland. Hamish's voice drifted out from the mist, seemingly coming from 3 directions at once as he moved through the hollows. And I've got a village that knows exactly who you are now. You think you can drive that shiny toy out of here? I told you I left a hazard on the road. Heather Graham was frantically climbing into the passenger seat. Miller, leave him! We need to get to the main road. Miller fired blindly into a clump of gorse, his frustration beginning to override his training. He retreated toward the driver's side, keeping his weapon leveled at the tree line. He slammed the car into reverse, the engine screaming as he attempted to pull a high-speed J-turn on the narrow track. But the hazard Hamish had mentioned wasn't a fallen tree or a boulder. It was much more Highland. Rounding the bend was a solid wall of wool lost sheep Hamish had predicted, driven up the track by the silent, unseen hands of the local poachers who owed Hamish a dozen favours for overlooked salmon. As the silver car lurched backward to avoid the flock, the rear tyres left the solid gravel of the logging trail and hit the vibrant, deceptive green of the black pot. The heavy engine at the front provided no balance as the back of the car suddenly dipped. The shrieking of tyres turned to a wet slurping sound as the peat bog claimed its prize. The sports car tilted at a sickening angle, the chassis groaning as it sank into the ancient muck. Miller scrambled out of the door, but the bog was hungry. His polished boots found no purchase, and he found himself waist-deep in the cold, black sludge, his pistol slipping from his mud-slicked fingers. Heather Graham was trapped in the tilting passenger seat, her screams finally echoing through the glen as the dark water began to seep over the expensive leather upholstery. Hamish stepped out from the mist, calm and unhurried, with Luggs sitting obediently at his side. He didn't look like a hero, he looked like a man who had just finished a long day's work and was thinking about his tea. He walked to the edge of the firm ground, looking down at the struggling architect and the ruined lady. "It's a terrible thing, the Highland mud," Hamish said, reaching down to pick up Miller's discarded journal, which had fallen onto a dry patch of heather. "It doesn't care about your London tailors or surnames. It just takes what's given. Now, if y'all stay very still and stop waving your arms about, I might just find a rope. But I wouldn't hold your breath. I move very, very slowly, as everyone in Strathbane likes to remind me." The slurping sound of the peat bog was the only music playing in the glen as the silver sports car settled deeper into its murky grave. Miller was now chest-deep in the black mire, his frantic struggles only serving to anchor him more firmly in the ancient Highland sludge. Heather Graham had managed to scramble out of the passenger side just before the door became pinned against a submerged rock, and she now stood on a precarious shelf of heather, her teal mohair scarf splattered with mud and her dignity in tatters. Hamish Macbeth watched them with the detached interest of a man observing a particularly slow-moving weather front. He produced a length of sturdy hemp rope from his pocket of poachers, tether head, been carrying for weeks, and began to loop it with agonizing deliberation. "You're a dead man, Macbeth," Miller wheezed, the cold water of the bog stealing the breath from his lungs. "You can't keep us here. There are people in London who will have your badge for breakfast." Well, they'll have to wait in line behind DCI Blair," Hamish replied, his voice a soft, rhythmic burr. "He's been wanting my badge since the day I failed to salute his dog. But I think you've got bigger problems than my career prospects. The tide's coming in on the loch, and the water table in these hills has a funny way of rising when it feels a heavy weight. If you don't grab this rope, you'll be part of the Blackwood ruins yourself before the pubs open." With a flick of his wrist, Hamish tossed the rope. It landed perfectly within Miller's reach. It took another 20 minutes of grunting, pulling, and a fair amount of Highland swearing before Hamish had both suspects sitting on the firm gravel, shivering and coated in a layer of peat that made them look like bog mummies. Luggs sat nearby, guarding the wooden box of bones with a low, vibrating growl that suggested he was perfectly willing to taste a bit of landscape architect if they tried to bolt. The sound of sirens finally returned to the glen, but this time they were accompanied by the heavy, rhythmic thumping of a police van. Hamish didn't reach for his radio. He simply waited until the first cruiser skidded to a halt and DCI Blair erupted from the driver's seat like a small, angry volcano. Blair's face was a shade of purple that suggested a looming medical emergency, and his eyes bulged as he took in the sight of the sunken sports car and the mud-caked socialites. "Macbeth!" Blair screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "What in the name of all that is holy is going on here? I left you to guard a bridge, not to play in the mud with the gentry. We've got Mac loud in the cells, and here you are, wasting time with a traffic accident." Hamish stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers and adopting a look of profound, wide-eyed stupidity. "Oh, it's a terrible business, sir. A real disaster. I was just out for my walk when these poor people had a bit of a mishap with the road. But then, while I was helping them out, I found this." He gestured toward the wooden box and the leather-bound journal he had placed prominently on the hood of the police cruiser. "It seems Mr. Pringle was right about the ghosts, Inspector. Only they weren't ghosts, they were evidence. I think Yow'll find that box contains the real reason Pringle was murdered. And that journal? It's got a list of names and dates that might make those lawyers in London very nervous." Blair's anger wavered, replaced by the unmistakable glint of professional greed. He grabbed the magazine, his eyes scanning the entries. As he realized the scale of the Finder 40-year-old cold case solved alongside a fresh murder involving International Estates' chest began to swell with unearned pride. "Evidence, you say?" Blair muttered, already imagining the headlines in the Strathbane Gazette. "Heroic DCI solves Blackwood mystery." He looked at the shivering Heather Graham and then Hamish. "I suppose you're going to tell me you did all the work, Macbeth." Hamish shook his head, a humble, vacant smile spreading across his face. "Me, sir? Heavens, no! I was just following your lead. You mentioned earlier that it was a dispute over property, and that's what led me to look at the estate records. If you hadn't pointed me in the right direction, I'd still be looking at bird nests. I think the super would be very impressed with how you managed the scene, sir. Especially the way you used the local constable as a decoy while you worked the angles from the station." Blair's suspicion vanished, swallowed whole by his own vanity. He straightened his tie, despite it being crooked, and barked orders at his men to bag the box and cuff the suspects. "Right! Well, it's good to see you finally learned how to follow a superior officer's intuition, Macbeth. I'll take it from here. You get back to the village and see if you can find someone to tow that car out. And keep your mouth shut. This is a high-level investigation now. No gossiping." As the police cars began to pull away, taking the ghost of Blackwood and her henchmen toward a long, cold future in a prison cell, Hamish whistled for lugs. He watched the taillights disappear into the mist, a small, satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Angus Mac Loud would be released by nightfall, the Blackwood secret was finally out, and best of all, DCI Blair was so convinced of his own genius that he'd never dream of promoting the useless village copper who had handed him the case on a silver tray. "Come on, lugs," Hamish said, turning toward the path home. "I think there's a pot of stew on the stove with our names on it." The following evening, the fog had finally retreated from the village, leaving the waters of the loch as still and black as a funeral shroud. In the small, cramped kitchen of the police station, the air was thick with a much more pleasant scent, a rich, peppery mutton stew simmering on the peat-fired stove. Hamish Macbeth sat in his favourite worn armchair, his feet propped up on a crate of confiscated cider, watching the blue smoke from his pipe curl toward the ceiling. Lugs lay across his boots, occasionally twitching a mismatched ear as he dreamed of chasing silver sports cars into the abyss. The front door creaked open, admitting a gust of cold Highland air and Priscilla Halberton-Smythe. She was dressed in a thick Aran sweater and moleskin trousers, looking every bit the local landlady despite the elegance that usually set her apart. She carried a small basket of oatcakes and a bottle of malt whiskey that Hamish knew, by the label alone, cost more than his monthly salary. "I heard the news from the postmistress. Hamish," she said, setting the basket on the table and pouring 2 generous measures of the amber liquid. "DCI Blair is holding a press conference in Strathbane. He's claiming he personally profiled the killer based on the choice of weapon. He's calling it the Needle of Justice case. I don't think he mentioned your name once, except perhaps to complain about the state of your boots." Hamish took a slow sip of whiskey, warmth blooming in his chest. "And that is exactly how I like it, Priscilla. If Blair thinks he's the hero of the piece, he'll be too busy polishing his ego to notice I am still here. If I were the one standing in front of the cameras, the superintendent would have me behind a desk in a city precinct before the weekend. I'd rather face a dozen murderers with knitting needles than a single Monday morning in an urban traffic department. But Angus is home," Priscilla noted, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "He's back at the forge. He told me you visited him this afternoon with a brace of poached salmon to apologize for the misunderstanding." Hamish blinked innocently. "I don't know what you mean by poached, Priscilla. Those fish practically jumped into my arms out of sheer respect for the law." He leaned back, his expression turning serious for a brief moment. It was a nasty business. Heather Graheimer, whoever she really was, lived a lie for 40 years. She wasn't the daughter who died in the fire, she was the cousin who set it. She killed the real Heather to inherit the Blackwood fortune, and when Arthur Pringle saw her digging for the evidence that would prove the child's body wasn't where it was supposed to be, she decided to tidy up another loose end. And the landscape architect, Miller, a mercenary for hire, Hamish sighed. He was there to dispose of the remains properly this time, but they forgot one thing about the Highlands. The past here doesn't just stay buried because you want it to. Earth is thin and memories are long. Arthur Pringle might have been a nuisance, but he loved this glen in his own twisted way. He died protecting its secrets, even if he didn't realize how dangerous those secrets were. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackle of the peat fire and the distant, mournful cry of a curlew over the water. The mystery of Blackwood Bridge was over. Another layer of Highland history settled back into the soil. The village would talk for months, of course, Mrs. Wellington would likely add a few more ghosts to the story by Christmas, but for now, the peace of Lockdub had been restored. Priscilla stood to leave, pausing at the door to look back at the lanky, deceptive man in the armchair. "You're a strange man, Hamish Macbeth. You solve the crimes no one else can, and then you work twice as hard to make sure no one gives you the credit for it. Don't you ever want more than this?" Hamish looked around his small, cluttered room, the warmth of the stove, the companionship of his dog, and the knowledge that tomorrow he could wake up and look out over the loch without a superior officer shouting in his ear. "More than this, Priscilla?" he asked with a faint, dry smile. "I don't think there is anything more. A quiet life is the hardest thing in the world. I'd say that's worth a bit of deception, wouldn't you?" As the door closed behind her, Hamish reached for the ladle and served himself a bowl of stew. He was a simple village copper again, a man who preferred tea to paperwork and mountains to motorways. He had saved an innocent man, seen a killer to justice, and most importantly, he had secured another season of beautiful, lazy insignificance. He took a bite of the stew, nodded in approval, and settled in for the night, perfectly content to be the smartest man that nobody in Scotland ever suspected.